Hello there, welcome back to another video. I'm setting a very ambitious challenge for myself over the next month. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know that this year I am focusing on whittling down my physical TBR shelf. I did a couple videos going over the books that are on my list. They are just a fraction of all of the ones that I truly have to get through. But I wanted to set a somewhat reasonable goal for myself for this year, given all of the other commitments I have in my life, and the fact that I don't have time to necessarily read 100 books in a calendar year. That being said, I realized that I'm already in June. We are 6 months into 2026, and I still have quite a few books left to read. So I figured I was going to kill a few birds with one stone. The first goal is a reading challenge video. I think these are super interesting. I love watching other booktubers do them, and so I figured I would like to do my own, and the timing, there's never a better time to start than now. Second goal is to get through my TBR list, not all of them, but like make a serious dent. And third is to actually start exchanging some of the ones that I read that I don't plan to read again, or that I just didn't find worthwhile enough to have on my shelves. Like, they were good, but I could find better, kind of a deal. So starting with the challenge, for the month of June, I'm going to try to read about 1,200 pages per week, which breaks down to roughly 4 books a week, give or take page counts. I am starting this first week with 4 books from my TBR shelf, and my thought process is to do an end of week wrap up that will become its own TBR shelf review where I go over all 4 books. So it makes it easier for me to get through the list, and also hopefully will force me to keep my thoughts a little bit more condensed, and so I don't spend an hour talking about one book, because I have to talk about 4, and I have to do so in at least an hour or less, ideally. As the month goes on, I have another video I'm working on around the exchange, goal 3, and as I'm working on that video, I will start bringing in some new books to supplement some of my TBR shelf. I may also decide to reread some books that I know that I enjoy if I need something that I can like make up the page count. I'm really hoping to read mostly new books, and I'm trying to do a mix of genres and a mix of fiction and nonfiction so that I don't get bored and hit a wall in, the first half of this challenge. That intro out of the way, I will show you the first 4 books I have chosen for week 1 of June. I am slightly cheating a bit. I started Brother of a Dragonfly at the end of May and have only 100 pages left exactly when I started it this morning, but it still counts towards my reading goal for June. It's also one of the ones for my TBR shelf, and so I think it fits naturally into my end of week wrap up TBR shelf review video that I plan to do. So that one should actually be finished today, and then I have 3 others that I'm going to try to get through in this week as well. We have The Lioness, which is one of the psychological thrillers. We have To End All Wars, which is nonfiction, and then we have Something Strange and Deadly. I think this is a new one that I don't believe I brought this one up in my fiction TBR shelf library video. I didn't realize that this is the same author, Susan Dennard, who wrote Sight Witch, that I read on my TBR shelf series and posted the review a couple weeks ago or something. But I enjoyed her writing in that book. I thought it was a fascinating story, and while I don't intend to continue that series right away, I was kind of excited to realize that this other one was on my shelf and dive into this. I think this one might actually be a standalone, and interestingly enough, it is the full book, and then there's like a novella the rest of this book, there's like another 200 pages, which is an e-novella apparently, and so written as, I guess, maybe a companion to Something Strange and Deadly, called A Dawn Most Wicked. So this book was obviously printed after that e-novel went out, and apparently was popular enough to demand a reprint where the full novels included and the short stories included. So I'm excited to dig into this one. I think this one should fly by pretty quickly. To End All Wars, I also anticipate will be not an easy read because of its subject matter, but a quick read. And I'm hoping The Lioness will also be fairly fast, just given the genre. I know sometimes I struggle to get into psychological thrillers and mystery novels, but there's always a point, if the book is good enough, that you get sucked in and then you're like, I want to figure out what's happening, and you stay up all night, or at least stay up way past your bedtime to finish the book. So that's the plan for this week. I have a spreadsheet made up for myself to track the books that I'm reading and the number of pages that I read every day, so I can just go update that. And I will let you know how I'm doing tomorrow on day 2. Day 1 is going to be finishing this book. I think I have about 40 pages left, and then picking up The Lioness. And I will let you know in the morning how far I got, and then at the end of the day, what my total page count is. Hello. It is June 3rd, so I am 3 days into my challenge of reading 1,200 pages a week for the entire month. I did end up finishing my first book, Brother to a Dragonfly, on Monday, and then I picked up my second book, The Lioness. I finished this one just this morning. I plan to do a separate video where I have a more in-depth review of each of the books that I read every week. For this video, I will say I gave this one a 4 out of 5. As I was reading this book, I feel like maybe this man was popular, and I should have known his name given his career and his heavy involvement in the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America. Apparently he was involved enough to be well known across the country, and participated in meetings with some of the other big names in the civil rights movements, like Martin Luther King Jr. What is that Keke Palmer meme of this poor man, I don't know him or whatever?
To say it, I hope I don't sound ridiculous. I don't know who this man is. I mean, he could be walking down the street. I wouldn't know a thing. Sorry to this man.
That's kind of how I felt with this book, where I'm like, oh, I probably should know you or know something about you. It doesn't harm the story at all to know nothing, and really it's not a biography about his life. I don't think the intention is to tell about himself, right? It is very much about him, his brother, and the relationship between the two of them from childhood through all of their experiences with what was happening in America during that time, the different paths that they choose in their lives, and how they each respond to the trials of being a human in this world, and how some people choose this stiff upper lip, and some people choose different forms of escape from it. The Lioness, I'd probably give 3 out of 5 stars. I think it was well written. If you like psychological thrillers, it was a really quick read. The next book I plan to pick up is To End All Wars. Somehow I ended up reading mostly books with a lot of people dying in them. So maybe next week I'll try to be a little bit better about, picking romances or more happy fiction and nonfiction, so that I'm not constantly depressed. But today I'm going to try to read a lot, maybe half of To End All Wars, because I have a lot of reading to do. Hey there, it is day 5 of my reading challenge for June. I am on my 4th book for the week, which is Something Strange and Deadly. I have this mistake of calling books fantasy when they are, but they tend to be more like gothic fantasy, which to me feels different than
a fantasy that is fae and fairy based and magic based. This is steampunk, which I think is still technically classified as a form of fantasy. On Goodreads it says that it's more of a speculative fiction genre, so I'm not entirely sure if it is considered fantasy. Anyway, it is going okay so far. I think I have about 100 pages left in the book itself, and then I have the story that goes along with it, the short story that goes along with it that I'm going to read. Overall, what I'm finding with the challenge is reading around 200 pages a day is fairly doable. I do have to consciously utilize my breaks here and there, those random 5 or 10 minutes between meetings or reading at lunch and breakfast and any sort of downtime, short downtime, awkward downtime. I do have to consciously read to get to 200 pages, and then I'll read in the morning and I'll read before bed. But generally that limit is doable to hit. Anything more than that, I do find that I kind of have to push myself to continue reading. I think some of it may just be that the books I chose haven't been completely engrossing. None of them have been ones where I want to stay up at night and read them. So I'm hopeful that maybe in the coming weeks I can choose some books that will give me that feeling. It's a little difficult because I'm doing books that are new to me, and most often these are also authors who I've never read, so it's hard to judge whether or not the book itself is going to be good. I'm kind of trying to just do it based off of genre and the summaries of the books. I think at this point, despite having some mixed feelings about my psychological thriller mystery books, that has been the easiest to get through so far, because they've also tended to be simpler, if that makes sense. I find the writing a lot more straightforward. There's a lot less description, a lot more action, I guess, is the alternative to that, so that it can be a faster read. It's also shorter. The books seem to be shorter in general than a fantasy book or a steampunk book or some of the other fiction books that I've picked out. So that is where I'm at almost the end of week 1. I will probably check in either tomorrow or maybe Monday. I have kind of a busy weekend, so I'm hoping to get all my reading in, but you may not see me until I start week 2, and I'll let you know how far I ended up getting this week and then what my next 4 books are for week 2 of the challenge.
We've officially made it to week 2 of my June reading challenge, which is reading 1,200 pages per week. I was able to finish the 4 books that I had selected for week 1 and actually started diving into one of my week 2 books. For week 2, I have selected another 4 books. The total of these, based off the page counts I did earlier, is 1,283 pages. So assuming that I can finish all 4 of them between today, which is Monday, and the end of Sunday night, I will accomplish my goal for week 2 of June. I've done the same process of 2 fiction books, 2 nonfiction books, each book in a slightly different genre, so that I have things that are interesting, some books that are faster reads than others, but I'm kind of, doing some damage on my TBRs on both sides of my library. I'll begin with the book that I've started already, which is The Oregon Trail. This is a book I thought was going to be about the Oregon Trail and an actual history book about pioneers who traversed the Oregon Trail in America in the 1840s and 50s. It is actually about a man who does his own journey across the Oregon Trail in the 2010s. I don't have much to say because I am only 30 pages in at this point. It is going to be a long read, but I think I'm pretty interested in hearing about his journey. It is one of those stories where, as someone who has a bit of wanderlust herself, like, I admire people who have the ability to just drop things and go, particularly people who do things that are quite outrageous and very physically challenging, because I'm not someone who ever intends to do things like climb Mount Everest, but I admire people who do that. So far, enjoying this book. Like I said, only 30 pages in, so I don't have a ton to report. The next book that I plan to pick up is this fiction novel called The Lost Summers of Newport. This one is just like a general fiction book set around Newport, obviously. It is written by a trio of authors. It follows 3 different timelines of 3 different women, all like centered around their experiences in Newport, Rhode Island. I think this one will be fun. I'll check in when I start reading it and let you know. My next nonfiction book is about World War II. This is particularly focused on 11 Days in December, so a battle that happened around Christmas in 1944. It is the shortest book this week, I believe, and I'm okay with that. I did try to pick my nonfiction strategically, so I wasn't just sitting down reading 900-page biographies and just force-feeding myself those books. Essentially, I still want to enjoy them, even with this goal of trying to hit 200 pages or so a day. Last but not least, I have another mystery thriller novel. The Crossing Places is my next one, featuring a forensic anthropologist and her cat. So I'm hoping this one will be really fun. As I've said earlier, the thriller genre has kind of been letting me down recently, so I'm hoping the more mystery-focused version will be more interesting to me to read. So that's what's on the docket for week 2. I'm hopeful, given my experience with week 1, that I will find this week a breeze and the challenge as a whole pretty easy breezy to knock out all of these books. I am very much enjoying just spending all of my extra time reading. I have some travel to do this week, and so my plan is on planes and automobiles and trains. I'm just going to be focused on my reading during those times, reading in the morning, reading at night before bed, hopefully knock out these page goals like nobody's business, and let you know probably every other day of the week where I'm at, what I'm enjoying, and go from there. Okay, people, I have a lot of books. We're gonna sit here with a pile. It is officially week 3 of my June reading challenge. Week 2 ended up being not what I planned. I did finish 4 books. They were not the 4 that I showed you at the beginning of the week. 2 of them were from that list, but 2 of them were not. My week got all messed up because I thought that I would have easy travels for a business trip, and that I would just be able to read on the plane and just at the airport and a lot of downtime. I ended up having a lot of downtime, but it was a very stressful travel experience, and by the time I was on my way home, I just didn't have any energy to pick up a book and read. So I used the Hoopla app that I have through the library and listened to a couple audiobooks instead. I am counting it towards my reading challenge, even though it's not a physical book from my TBR shelf or just a physical book in general. I am counting it because I did read, so it still suits the spirit of the challenge, I think. I also have been making very steady progress on my TBR books, which I'm very proud of. I ended up finishing The Lost Summers. I thought this book was very well done. I was curious if I would feel a discrepancy between each author's voice, given it's from a trio, but they all blended together super well. It was a fascinating story. I love when you have characters who are an expert in a certain field, and so Andy, who is our more like modern day present time perspective. She has studied historical preservation, particularly like home conservation, I guess, and like restoring mansions is her dream. And it's very fun to have someone who is an expert in that type of stuff and like what she focuses on and some of the dreams that she has and how her life has evolved where it is. Overall, super fun book. Definitely like 4 out of 5. I wasn't like dying to reread it after I finished, but it was a very fun story. I think these authors have another book or two that they've written together, and I definitely would be willing to give them a go and would recommend The Lost Summers of Newport if you're looking for like a fun beach read or just like something just to pass the time. Good book. The next book that I actually finished is The Crossing Places. I looked it up the other day and it's actually book 1 of a 15-book series. It's a really fun story set in England on the salt marshes. I loved the characters. There was some interesting plots around marriage and love, relationships and adultery. And there's a dynamic between our main character, or 2 main characters. Their relationship is cute, and also I'm a little bit conflicted because he's married, but like you're kind of rooting for them to be together. And it's weird to have an experience of like supporting adultery because there is no intention of him leaving his wife. I think based off of reading some glimpses of the next 15 books that like maybe the 2 do end up together officially married. I don't know. Anyway, very cute dynamic between the 2 of them. Very sad story to read because it deals with little girls going missing. I love the landscape of it. Like, I think books set in kind of the outskirts of the UK are very interesting. You know, it's not civilized in some respects, despite the fact that these countries are very small. They do have a diverse ecosystem, and it is fascinating to read one that's set in such a barren environment and like what that does to the people who live there and how they learn to like live with the land around them. Probably like a 4.5 stars is what I would give The Crossing Places. I wouldn't call it necessarily a cozy mystery. It was a pretty fast read for the most part, but it's like very classic British mystery series. And I think at some point I might continue the series. Not right now though, because 15 books is just honestly a lot to take on when I'm reading so many other things. It's also one of those series where I think you could probably like take time off in between. I would imagine that they feel like pretty standalone. These do have the vibes of like an airport read almost, where it's like a 300-page book, so you could easily pick any of one of the books in the series up and just like read it in one go without missing a ton of context for the characters or for the world and so on. So that is The Crossing Places. The next 2 books I read were audiobooks. The first one was The Imposter, which is a psychological suspense novel. It is, I think, actually the second in the series. I didn't really care what it was. I wanted something that was fiction. I wanted something that was easy to listen to, that was relatively engaging, because I was just literally sitting at an airport waiting on flights that kept being delayed and delayed and delayed. This one was okay. I gave it 2 stars. It gets really twisted and dark by the end. Like, she is not afraid to torture and really physically harm and potentially kill other people to get what she wants. I'm not going to say it was a fun book. If I wasn't in a place where I just wanted something to listen to, I probably wouldn't have picked this book up. Don't really recommend it. It wasn't like the most well-written book either, and none of the characters were anyone that I would be friends with or enjoy in real life. Like, they were all really annoying and like bad people. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say about it. And the next one I read was by Veronica Roth. It's part of her Curse Bearer series, which I know nothing about. The book is called When Among Crows. It was a very fast audiobook. I think it was only like a 4.5 hour audiobook. It was kind of fun because it's set in Chicago, which is where I was flying home from. So it was just like, I had a little bit of context for the city, and when she talks about the underground world of Chicago, like that truly exists. Chicago is built in such a way that you essentially have a city on top of a city, because they, hide all the unsightly stuff, like garbage and drug deals and homeless people and all the quote-unquote uncivilized things of the world happen underneath the main city, and the city that is made for tourists and nice, clean business people and so on and so forth. It's just, a tad problematic. Anyway, the story is about this like group of magical entities. There's 3 primary species of magical creatures that all come from like Russian and Polish and Eastern European folklore, which is really fun to me because I think my experience with fantasy has been more of like the traditional westernized ideas of it. And so you have like a lot of elves and fairies and things that that have come from like Grimm's fairy tales and so on. So it's always fun for me to experience a magical system that relies on folklore from other civilizations and ancient peoples and histories. So we have these 3 different creatures. I don't know how to say any of the names of them, but they all essentially exist on different human emotions. And they don't even have to be human emotions. But one feeds off of fear, one feeds off of anger, and one feeds off of sorrow. And then we have our group of like holy knights who kind of exist to keep the magical world and non-magical world in balance. We have this curse that kind of hops around between these different magical creatures. It has a cure, but it's very difficult because like you have to have a human who helps you get the cure. And so these knights kind of help keep the magical world in check and don't let these cursed creatures roam around in the wild and potentially wreak havoc on places and on humans. It's a fun story. It was a very fast story. That is When Among Crows. I think I gave this, 4 stars. So those are the 4 books that I finished last week. I did pick up The Oregon Trail. I am about halfway through at this point. So I'm going to continue reading this book into my week 3 of the challenge. It'll count for about 200 pages of week 3, and it was 200 pages for week 2. The other book that I picked up is also my second nonfiction that I had selected for week 2. This is 11 Days in December, all about a battle in World War II. So I'm going to also continue to plan to read this for week 3. I have 2 new fiction books that I have selected as well. This is a new book to me. It's called Think Twice. I picked this up from a local free little library. I think it's like a mystery book. And then I picked up We Are Called to Rise. I picked this one up because of the fact it's also another like 3-person perspective story, and I did like that in The Lost Summers of Newport. It's much shorter. It's only 300 pages, and it follows a middle-aged woman, a returning soldier, and a very brave 8-year-old immigrant boy, all in Las Vegas. So I think this one will be fun to read. And then if I calculated my page counts, I will have like another 150 or so pages that I will need to read, assuming I finish all 4 of these. And so I grabbed American Rhapsody. This is a nonfiction book about
I guess some writers, musicians, movie stars, and one great building. That is all I know from the front of the book. But this will hopefully round out my week 3 for about 150 pages, and then I'll continue this on into week 4 of the challenge in June. And with that, we're gonna keep reading, and I will check in with y'all later. We are back. We are at this point, it is Wednesday of week 3 in my June reading challenge. I meant to keep checking in, but life got in the way, if that's a good excuse. Monday, I was off work. We had a long holiday weekend with Juneteenth, and so I had other plans with my partner and ended up reading a ton that day, but not having a chance to film. And then yesterday, back at work, again, meant to record in the evening, but I spent the time reading instead. So I'm doing really well on getting my page count in. I'm just doing very poorly on checking in on my challenge and actually filming for it. So I'm gonna go over the books I read in week 3 and then tell you what I'm reading in week 4 of the challenge. I have 4 books that I read last week. I'm gonna start with the nonfiction book that I actually began reading in week 2 and then finish in week 3. This is The Oregon Trail by Rinker Buck. I have mixed feelings about this book. I thought it was a fascinating way of combining history with a memoir essentially, because we have Rinker, who kind of grew up in the late 1900s in more of a small town setting in New England, America, and grew up like surrounded by Amish and Mennonite, and a father who was very much like hands-on experience and lived on a farm, taught his children to raise animals and drive a wagon team and so on and so forth. Rinker decides he's at a low point in his life, ends up on a road trip kind of stumbling upon this Oregon Trail, this portion of the Oregon Trail with a visitor center, and just falls in love with this idea of doing the Oregon Trail in the 21st century. And so he plans this whole trip, and he buys a wagon and he buys a mule team, and his brother and his brother's dog come along for this trip in 2011 to do the Oregon Trail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Oregon, and follow as much of the original Oregon Trail as possible. So it's like a fascinating challenge. It's one of those things where I'm like, I personally don't have any desire to do that. And this book constantly reminded me that I would be seriously out of my element if I ever tried to like survive on my own and make things for myself and do. There were so many times in this book where I'm like, oh my lord, I am very dependent on modern day amenities in my life. I could not do this. But it's always fascinating to read about people who do take on that challenge and force themselves to kind of like live off the land and have this really intense physical, mental experience. And it was also cool because he talks about his time doing the Oregon Trail and intersperses it with stories of like, depending on where he's on the trail, like what were pioneers facing during the 1800s when they were making these journeys. So you learn a lot of interesting things, like the fact that there is no one Oregon Trail. Some of the stuff that you would find boring too, just like how wagons developed and why the pioneers used the wagons that they did, and all of the capitalism that kind of goes around the trail as well, of essentially people creating monopolies around breeding mules or the best wagon and scalping really poor people for all their money. It's super fascinating to learn about the history. It's one of those kinds of books where you realize how much you didn't learn in school. So I very much appreciated that. I appreciated reading Rinker's story as well of his trip. His writing can just be long-winded sometimes, which is why this book took me 2 weeks to get through, is because it's only what, just over 400 pages, so it's not terribly much longer than some of the other books I've been reading this challenge in a week, but it felt like a significantly longer book, and it just took time for me to get through because I could really only handle maybe 3 or 4 chapters in one sitting before I just needed to put it down and move on to something else. Like it didn't grab me and hold me into the story super well. So I can't remember, I think I maybe gave this 3 or 4 stars, somewhere in that range of like 3.5 stars. The next book I read is this fiction book, Think Twice, that I picked up from a free little library. It is like mystery thriller is the genre that I'd place it in. It's about a pair of twin sisters who flip identities. So it's Alice and Benny. They grew up in separate households because the mom couldn't support both of them, so she gave one of the girls up for adoption. They've only recently, prior to the story that takes place in this book, they've learned about each other's existence. They haven't like completely reconciled, and Alice has very psychopathic tendencies that Benny can't quite wrap her head around, and Benny's like very conflicted of, you never got to know our mother, so I feel like I owe you something as a sister and as your twin, even more so. Alice decides that she's going to take over Benny's life for a period of time because something happened that she needs to escape and leave the country, and she's like, I'm gonna take over Benny's identity, I'm gonna steal all her money, I'm gonna leave the country, it's gonna be great. She tries to completely remove Benny in the beginning of the book. That doesn't go so well for her, and so we enter the story of Alice trying to live in Benny's shoes for about 3-5 days, and Benny waking up buried alive from Alice's attempts to remove her from the situation, trying to figure out what happens and it becomes a story not about Benny getting back her life, but also getting revenge on Alice. There are specific choices that were made to make this story work that tested my suspension of disbelief as a reader. I think the writing was okay. All in all, like, it was fine. 3 stars is what I'd give it, of like, if you like mystery thrillers, if you're looking for something that's a quick read, if you're looking for something that has action but not necessarily gore, sure, this was kind of cool. Again, kind of unrealistic. I honestly will probably put this back in the pile of exchanging to the free little library again, because I don't see myself continuing to read this author or this series because it just wasn't that great. Next up, we actually have a DNF. I didn't lay out any rules for myself at the beginning of the challenge of, if I came across a book that I truly didn't want to finish, what would I do? I entered the challenge with this assumption or this intent for myself that I was going to pick books that I was interested in reading, and therefore I would finish them. I chose to pick up one of my nonfiction books called American Rhapsody. Had no clue what this was. It is a very coffee table nonfiction book. It's a lot of vignettes about writers and authors and movie stars and musicians in the roaring 20s of America. So like when jazz came to be, when there was like just this shift in the intellectual and literary world of that time period because of World War I. Some of the through lines that the author was trying to lay out were interesting, and there's a lot of interesting people that she writes about, but I didn't like the format of this, and I didn't like her writing style. It was very highbrow vocabulary, if that makes sense. It's like, it's not fun to read when you struggle to follow what on earth someone just said in a sentence. It's not even that she was using vocabulary that was unfamiliar to me. It was very academic writing, if that makes sense.
the writing style would consistently pull me away from the narratives of these people that she's talking about. So I didn't give it a rating because I just don't think that's fair to do when I DNF'd it. I did get about 50% through, which is pretty good. I did that more because I was just like trying to get page numbers in. But that is American Rhapsody. And then the last book for week 3 that I read is this novel called We Are Called to Rise. It follows 4 different characters in Las Vegas, and the theme plays on this idea of like all the different tiny choices and moments we have as people, and how all of our lives kind of interconnect in ways that are both unexpected and surprising and terrible and sad and beautiful and joyful, and just this kaleidoscope of what it means to be human and to be human together in community. All 4 characters come from extremely different backgrounds. They're different ages, they're different races, they are different education levels, struggling with different things in their lives, and yet they all kind of interconnect in these very both meaningful and meaningless ways. It's a beautiful story. It's a very sad story. It was a hard book to read because what happens is devastating to these characters, but it was also very hopeful in the fact that it does just let everyday humans shine, and that's always encouraging to read about. That's We Are Called to Rise. I know I didn't talk about the book very much, but I would recommend that you read it. So I don't really want to talk too much about the characters and what happens. The writing is very well done, the characters are very well done, and it's not a terribly long book, so if you picked it up, you could probably finish it in a weekend. And I would recommend that you do. Probably 4 stars is what I would give to We Are Called to Rise. So at the end of week 3, I ended up being, I think, 100 pages short of my 1,200 page goal for the week, which is fine. Like, I knew there would be at least 1 week this month that I wouldn't hit my target, but I got pretty dang close, which is good. I'm gonna go over my list for week 4 pretty quickly because I have just been jibber-jabbering non-stop. I have finished 2 of them already. Like I said, I spent Monday and Tuesday just reading and reading and reading. Ended up finding what I think is probably going to be my only 5-star book of this month, but that was very good to have that experience finally. I didn't realize until I was a few chapters into this book and had that moment of like, oh, I'm hooked, that that's what I needed for this challenge. I think it's good as a reader to not have every book you read be a 5-star. At the same time, it is difficult to go a long time without having a 5-star book and something that makes you just kind of sit there and sigh and be like, this is what I love. Like, this interaction is what I love as a reader. And this is what, keeps me coming back, is authors who are just able to tell a beautiful story in a beautiful way. The book is The Frozen River. This is one of my mystery books. It is set in the late 1700s in America in Massachusetts on a river. Very small community, and so we get to interact with a lot of the characters who live in this town. Our main character is named Martha. She is in her 50s. She's a midwife for this community. I absolutely loved following a character who is very established in her life and has this like full history and this full family and this full career. I appreciated following someone who wasn't, at the cusp of adulthood. She's very sure of herself, very competent, and very trusted in her community, which I very much appreciated. I think I talked about this when I was reading The Crossing Places, that I just like books where people are experts and are doing the thing that they're an expert at, and you just like get a little glimpse into them loving their job and loving to help, particularly in Arthur's case, like the women in her community with something that can be very scary and very deadly to mother and child. So that was really cool. The plot itself is there's a woman in her community who's claimed that 2 men have essayed her, and one of those men ends up being found drowned in the frozen river, and maybe he was murdered. What's going to happen now? Like, is this woman going to get justice? Is this man going to get justice? What does justice even look like at this time in American history? Highly, 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 highly recommend The Frozen River. I'm going to be checking out some of this author's other books because I loved it, and I'm hoping that some of her other stuff will be 5-star reads for me, which I really want. The next book I then proceeded to read is Night by Elie Wiesel. I should know how to say this man's name. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But this is a Holocaust survivor, and this is his very short biography, kind of his time in Auschwitz and in a few different concentration camps towards the end of World War II. His family lives in what was Transylvania at that time, and so they don't end up being taken and sent to these concentration camps until 1944, and so very tail end of the war, but I'm sure a year felt like an eternity in these awful circumstances. Just the amount of people who died and suffered terribly is devastating. It was very hard to read, very short. I think this book was all of like 115 pages, so I read it in a day. It is very sad. However, and I say however, not to diminish any of the personal experiences told in this book or to diminish the horrible travesty that was the Holocaust. Like, please don't get me wrong, awful time in history, should never have happened. Like, Nazis were terrible people. What they did to Jewish communities, LGBTQ communities, and Romani people, like, awful, terrible, 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 terrible. What I will say about this book and what I said about To End All Wars is I fundamentally don't understand how you can have those experiences and come out still believing in some type of all-powerful, all-good God, and yet allows things like this to happen. And I just fundamentally don't understand how you can come out believing in that when you have this type of experience. So it's hard to read. And then the book that I just now picked up this morning to read is The Woman in Cabin 10. This is a Ruth Ware novel. I had no idea who this person was until a couple weeks ago. I was talking with one of my coworkers about some of the books I've been reading and that I'm trying to get more into mystery and psychological thrillers. And he was like, "Oh, do you read Ruth Ware? My wife loves her books." And I'm like, never heard of her. Totally forgot. Didn't realize that I had one of her novels on my shelf. So we'll see how this is. And then the very last nonfiction book I have selected for June, which I may or may not get through. This is the one I anticipate that I might continue reading until the actual end of the month and not finish by Sunday of this week. But it is a Marie Antoinette biography. It is a book that I've had sitting on my shelf for a very long time and on my TBR list for over a decade at this point. It was recommended to me way back in my high school days when I was babysitting for a family and the mom was reading it. We had talked a bit about biographies at that point, so she knew that, you know, I enjoy good biographies. So she recommended this to me, and it's been, you know, on my TBR for ever since. Finally going to pick it up, read it, see what it's about. I'm hoping that this is better than the Abigail Adams biography that I recently read. Otherwise, I might be DNFing this one because I think it's even longer. Hopefully it's a good 458 pages.
And that is the books I have for my last week of my June reading challenge. I will check in maybe sometime this week, or you might not see me till the conclusion of the video. Today is Monday, June 29th, which means I am officially complete with my June reading challenge, in which I attempted to get through as many of my physical TBR books as I possibly could over this month, aiming for around 1,200 pages per week. If I did all of my calculations correct, I only missed 1 week, the week that I was traveling, which shouldn't be surprising. And most of the other weeks I ended up hitting my goal or just over my goal, which is super awesome. For my final week, because I recorded a few days in, I already ended up talking through 2 of the books that I read, and then I have 3 more that I also dug into over the week. This is The Woman in Cabin 10, which I had just started. It is my first Ruth Ware book, and overall it was pretty decent. It definitely does have that feel of like airport mystery novel, like very surface level, very glamorous in some respects. All the characters are not normal, so everyone's like either super pretty or super wealthy or just very extreme characters. As someone who doesn't drink, it was also really annoying the first third of the book how much alcohol is relied upon for stress relief or socialization and so on and so forth. That's probably not a detractor for a lot of people, and a lot of people I know do engage in that activity. But as someone who is part of Gen Z and the generation that is kind of steering away from drinking as a hobby or social activity, it felt very distasteful to me and kind of put me off of our female main character for a while. Our female main character also has pretty severe depression and panic attacks, and I'm not going to say it wasn't portrayed well in the book. It was just hard because it's kind of the only mode of behavior she has throughout the entire story. And it is set up that that's probably what's going to happen based off of the beginning, in which she experiences a break-in, and that is not a spoiler to the actual mystery that happens here. The break-in itself feels very random, like there's no real reason to the plot for why it happens beyond serving as a means to explain why she's going to be on high alert and panicky and anxious and maybe not in the right headspace throughout the duration of this story. It made sense. It was just honestly very frustrating and hard to then relate to her throughout the story, because it felt like you weren't seeing her at her best, and you weren't really like even seeing her. You were seeing the more like unstable, chemically unbalanced side of her, if that makes sense. It was just a weird reading experience. The story though was interesting enough. I think I finished this in like 2 days, maybe 2.5 days or something like that, and probably give it, I don't know, 3 out of 5 stars. It is, like I said, it's definitely an airport mystery novel, so it has readability, just not rereadability, if that makes sense. I picked up this Marie Antoinette biography, and honestly, I'm going to continue finishing it, but this was just not the style of book I wanted as I was completing my reading challenge. Stay tuned. I don't know how much to say at this point because I'm only 20 pages in. This book is going to be extremely dense and somewhat dry to get through, so it may be a while before I complete it. As an alternative, I picked up what I think is actually my last mystery thriller novel that I have on my physical TBR shelf, which is kind of exciting. This was like a very classic British mystery. Honestly, it was weird. It's set up in books, in so different sections, and there's 5 of them, and we don't meet our main detective until book 2. Our first book is like the introduction to this little English community, who our main characters are, who like our cast of characters are in this mystery, in the murder that happens. And it's a laboratory and, you know, a local police force that were first introduced to us through the context of another murder that they're called to and that they're trying to solve. And then one of the head biologist at the lab, the head forensic biologist, ends up being murdered, and we get into our classic whodunit. Very Sherlock Holmes coded, not in like a bad way, just in like our main detective is very smart, very cold and standoffish, very lonely, has his little sidekick character, yeah, and you know, just like classic British mystery, like I said. I don't want to give this one a 5 out of 5 stars because it wasn't perfection, but maybe like 4.5 rounded down to a 4 on Goodreads is what I'd give this. But yeah, we're done with the challenge. If I totaled all my numbers correctly, at the end of this month, I have read 4,790 pages, which is really cool. I thought that I would struggle with this challenge a lot more. Like, I definitely thought it would be doable, but I thought it was going to require me to spend basically all of my free time reading. And don't get me wrong, there were days where I was definitely fighting for extra minutes to read, but between some like longer weekends or just days when I could spend maybe 3-4 hours reading, I found getting around 1,200 pages to be pretty achievable. I will caveat that I don't anticipate pushing myself to do this going forward. It was nice to like get myself into a reading headspace and really have to focus and ingrain the habit of picking up a book first before I did something like pick up my phone. And I do want to keep that habit going forward because I have too much screen time as is. So I want to be conscious when I have 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, that it's not my phone that I gravitate to, but it is a book that I pull out, even if it's 10 pages a day or 20 pages a day. It doesn't have to be the 200 plus pages a day that I've been trying to hit for. But I want to keep up the habit of consistently reading in my spare time. What I am looking forward to, though, is not having the pressure of needing to read to meet a number. That did become pretty exhausting by the end of this month, of that constant refrain in the back of my head of, oh, I have to read because I've done so many pages this week, and you just have the running tally going in your head of the page count that you have to meet, and that did become a little exhausting. That's when I found I needed to move more into the fiction space the further along in the challenge I went, because nonfiction being something that I kind of have to sit with longer and just feels harder to get through, that's when I found the running tally of page counts in my head hard to like push past and really get into any of the nonfiction books that I chose. So I'm gonna be glad to kind of take a step back and not feel rushed to read. I am glad I did this challenge though. Hopefully you all found it super interesting. I'm totally open to doing some more reading challenges. I think they're fun, I think they're interesting, and it could be based off of page counts or, you know, reading a specific genre. Definitely open to suggestions in the comments. So please subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.